Imagine building a mighty warship to defend your nation, only for it to be destroyed not by your enemy, but by your closest ally. For the French battleship Bretagne, this nightmare became a reality in the summer of 1940. Her story, and that of her two sisters, Provence and Lorraine, is one of ambition, obsolescence, and profound tragedy. These were ships born of one global conflict, only to meet their varied and violent destinies in the chaos of another. They were the Bretagne-class, the last dreadnoughts of the French Navy, relics of a bygone era, forced to confront the brutal realities of World War II. Their tale is not just one of steel and firepower, but of the desperate political choices that can turn friends into foes and seal the fate of thousands. In the early 20th century, the oceans of the world were a chessboard for the great powers, and the new queen of the board was the dreadnought battleship. Sparked by Britain's revolutionary HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a frantic naval arms race had erupted across Europe. Every major nation scrambled to build bigger, faster, and more powerfully armed battleships. France, a nation with a proud naval tradition, found itself falling behind its rivals, particularly the burgeoning navies of Germany and Italy. The French Parliament, recognizing the danger, passed the Statute Naval, or Naval Law, of 1912. This was a bold and expensive plan to restore French naval prestige, authorizing the construction of 28 battleships by 1920. The first ships laid down under this law were the Corbeil-class, France's initial entry into the dreadnought age. But technology was moving fast, and even as the Corbeils were being completed, they were already being outclassed. The French Admiralty needed something better, something that could stand up to the latest Italian and Austro-Hungarian designs. The answer was the Bretagne-class. The design was constrained by the size of French dry docks, meaning they couldn't be much larger than the Corbeils they were replacing. If they couldn't be bigger, they had to be smarter. The designers made a critical decision. They would mount a revolutionary new weapon, a 340mm 45 caliber gun. This was a significant step up from the 305mm guns of the Corbeil class and was intended to give the French ships a decisive edge in firepower. To fit these massive weapons onto the limited hull size, the naval architects made a clever choice. They arranged all 5 twin turrets on the center line of the ship. 2 turrets were mounted forward in a superfiring pair. 1 was amidships and 2 were aft, also in a superfiring arrangement. This was a first for the French Navy, and it allowed all 10 main guns to fire on a broadside, maximizing the ship's hitting power. It was an efficient, if somewhat cramped, design. The 3 ships, Bretagne, Provence, and Lorraine, were authorized on May 1, 1912, and laid down in French shipyards over the next few months. Their armor protection was respectable for the era, with a main belt of up to 270mm, or about 10.6 inches, of cemented steel. Their decks were less protected, a common design flaw in early dreadnoughts whose designers hadn't yet fully anticipated the threat of long-range plunging shellfire or aerial bombs. Propulsion came from 4 steam turbines, with the outer pair powered by high-pressure turbines and the inner pair by low-pressure ones. Initially, they were designed to be powered by a mix of coal and oil, a transitional technology that would soon give way to pure oil-firing systems. With a top speed of around 20 knots, or 23 miles per hour, 37 kilometers per hour, they were not particularly fast, but they packed a serious punch for their size. As they were being built, the storm clouds that had been gathering over Europe finally burst. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 found the Bretagne-class battleships still fitting out. They were rushed to completion and entered service one by one in 1915 and 1916. Assigned to the 1st Battle Squadron of the French Mediterranean Fleet, their primary mission was to help contain the Austro-Hungarian Navy within the Adriatic Sea. It sounds like a dramatic task, but in reality, it was a long and tedious vigil. The Austro-Hungarians rarely sortied their main fleet, and the French, wary of the threat from submarines and naval mines in the confined waters of the Adriatic, were hesitant to push in. For the mighty Bretagne class, the Great War was largely a war of waiting. They spent most of their time at anchor in Corfu and Mudros, their powerful guns silent, their crews battling little more than boredom. Their only taste of anything resembling action was when the crew of the Provence voiced their anti-war sentiments in 1919, a reflection of the war weariness that had settled over all of Europe. When peace finally came, the Bretagne-class found themselves in a rapidly changing world. They were now veterans, but the pace of naval technology had not slowed. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 severely limited the construction of new battleships, forcing navies to make do with their existing hardware. For the Bretagne-class, this meant a series of modernizations to try and keep them from becoming completely obsolete. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the ships were cycled through the shipyards for extensive refits. One of the most important upgrades was to their main armament. The original gun mountings only allowed for 12 degrees of elevation, limiting their range to a mere 14,500 meters. The mountings were modified to increase elevation to 18 degrees, pushing the range out to a more respectable 18,000 meters. Later, they were fitted with new 340mm guns that allowed for 23 degrees of elevation, extending their reach to over 26,000 meters. Their fire control systems were also modernized with the installation of new rangefinders. The ship's propulsion systems also saw a major overhaul. The old, inefficient coal-fired boilers were removed and replaced with new, smaller, oil-fired boilers. This not only increased their operational range and made refueling far easier, but the space saved allowed for the installation of proper torpedo bulkheads, improving their underwater protection. The forward funnel was trunked into the aft one, giving the ships a more modern single-funnel silhouette. As the threat from aircraft grew, their anti-aircraft defenses were repeatedly enhanced, with various small-caliber guns being added to their superstructures. The most unique modernization was reserved for the Lorraine. Between 1934 and 1936, her central 340mm turret was removed entirely. In its place, a hangar and a catapult were installed, designed to house 3 seaplanes. The idea of a battleship carrying its own reconnaissance aircraft was trendy at the time, but placing the facility amidships, right behind the funnel, was awkward. It was a compromise that turned the Lorraine into a peculiar hybrid, but it would be a refit that, in a strange twist of fate, may have contributed to her ultimate survival. When World War II erupted in September 1939, the three sisters were over 2 decades old. They were slow, lightly armored by modern standards, and outclassed by the new generation of fast battleships being built by Italy and Germany. Nevertheless, they were still powerful symbols of French naval might and were immediately pressed into service. The Bretagne and Provence formed a screening force in the Atlantic, protecting convoys from the threat of German surface raiders. The Lorraine was sent to the eastern Mediterranean. They were workhorses, performing the unglamorous but essential tasks of a navy at war. But their world was about to be turned upside down. In May 1940, Germany launched its blitzkrieg against France and the Low Countries. Within weeks, the French army was shattered, and the government was on the verge of collapse. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. The fall of France created a crisis of epic proportions for Great Britain. Now standing alone against the Axis, the British government under Winston Churchill looked at the powerful French navy with extreme anxiety. The French fleet was the 4th largest in the world, and if its modern battleships like the Richelieu and Dunkirk, along with cruisers and destroyers, were to fall into German or Italian hands, the balance of power at sea would shift disastrously against the Royal Navy. The armistice terms stated the French fleet would be disarmed under German supervision, but Churchill and his war cabinet simply could not trust Hitler to honor that agreement. A terrible decision was made. If the French ships would not join the British or sail to a neutral port to be interned, they would have to be neutralized. This plan was given a code name, Operation Catapult. The largest concentration of French naval power was at the base of Mers-el-Kébir in French Algeria. Moored there were the battleships Dunkirk and Strasbourg, and alongside them, their older half-sisters, the Bretagne and Provence. On the morning of July 3, 1940, a powerful British squadron, designated Force H, appeared off the coast. Commanded by Admiral James Somerville, it included the battlecruiser HMS Hood, the battleships HMS Valiant and Resolution, and the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Admiral Somerville sent an emissary to the French commander, Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul, with an ultimatum containing several options: sail with the British and continue the fight, sail to a British or neutral port for internment, or scuttle their ships. If none of these options were accepted within 6 hours, the Royal Navy would use whatever force was necessary to prevent the ships from falling into enemy hands. For Admiral Gensoul, the ultimatum was an outrageous insult to French honor. He was bound by the Armistice Agreement and his orders from the French Admiralty. He refused to comply. For hours, tense negotiations went on, but no compromise could be found. As the deadline approached, British aircraft from the Ark Royal dropped magnetic mines to block the harbor entrance. At 5:54 p.m., with the sun beginning to set, Churchill gave the final, fateful order. The guns of Force H opened fire. The first salvos from the 15-inch guns of the British capital ships crashed into the harbor. The French ships, moored tightly together and unable to maneuver, were sitting ducks. They were also unprepared, with many of their crews still ashore. Chaos erupted as shells rained down on the unprepared fleet. The battleship Provence was hit several times. One shell from the Hood ignited a massive fire near her aft turret, and she began to flood. Her captain made the desperate decision to run her aground in the shallow harbor to prevent her from sinking entirely. For her sister ship, the Bretagne, there would be no such escape. She was struck by at least 4 15-inch shells in quick succession. The projectiles tore through her thin deck armor. One likely hit an ammunition handling room, and another penetrated deep into the ship's engine spaces. Within minutes, a massive fire was raging out of control. Then, the unthinkable happened. A colossal explosion ripped the Bretagne in half. A plume of fire and smoke shot hundreds of feet into the air as her aft magazines detonated with unimaginable violence. The ship, which had taken years to build and had served for a quarter of a century, capsized and sank in less than 2 minutes. She took with her 977 members of her crew. It was a slaughter. The brutal, devastating attack was over in less than 15 minutes. The bond between the two great Allied navies was shattered in a storm of fire and steel. Mers-el-Kébir was a military success for the British, but a political and human tragedy of the highest order. In the aftermath of the attack, the fates of the three sisters diverged completely. The burned-out, grounded hulk of the Provence was a smoldering testament to the day's horror. She was eventually refloated, and after temporary repairs, was sailed to the main French naval base at Toulon in southern France, which was still under the control of the collaborationist Vichy government. There, she sat, disarmed and idle, the ghost of her former self. Her final moment came in November 1942. In response to the Allied landings in North Africa, German forces invaded the unoccupied zone of France to seize the fleet at Toulon. Determined not to let their ships fall into enemy hands, the French commanders gave the order to scuttle the entire fleet. On November 27th, the crew of the Provence opened her Seacocks and planted demolition charges, sending the old dreadnought to the bottom of the harbor for good. She was later salvaged by the Italians and then the Germans, but her fighting days were over. Her wreck was finally broken up for scrap after the war. The third sister, Lorraine, had escaped this entire tragic saga by pure chance. At the time of the fall of France, she was in the eastern Mediterranean, operating with British forces. She had put into the port of Alexandria, Egypt, where she found herself anchored alongside a powerful British fleet. Following the events at Mers-el-Kébir, tensions were incredibly high. But here, the outcome was different. The two commanders, British Admiral Andrew Cunningham and French Admiral René-Émile Godefroy, were old friends. Through careful and patient negotiation, they reached a peaceful solution. Godefroy agreed to disarm his ships and land their fuel, effectively immobilizing them. In return, Cunningham promised not to try and seize them by force. For 3 years, the Lorraine sat peacefully interned in Alexandria, a neutral spectator to the raging war. It was her unique aircraft-carrying conversion that helped seal this deal. Her central turret was gone, making her less of an immediate threat and arguably a less tempting prize. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The Allies had landed in North Africa, and many French units were now rejoining the fight under the banner of the Free French. In May 1943, Admiral Godefroy finally agreed to rally his squadron to the Allied cause. The old battleship Lorraine, after years of inactivity, was about to go to war again. She sailed for an extensive refit, where her aircraft facilities were removed and replaced with a battery of modern anti-aircraft guns. She emerged leaner and bristling with defenses, a veteran warship ready for one last chapter. Her moment of redemption came in August 1944 during Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. The Lorraine joined a massive Allied fleet, and on August 15th, she opened fire on her own homeland. Her targets were the formidable German coastal batteries and fortifications around the city of Toulon, the very same port where her sister Provence had been scuttled. For several days, the Lorraine's old 340mm guns, the same weapons installed 3 decades earlier, relentlessly pounded the German positions. She dueled with coastal batteries, provided fire support for advancing ground troops, and helped blast the defenders into submission. It was a moment of supreme poetic justice. A ship built to defend France, which had been sidelined by politics and tragedy, was now playing a direct and crucial role in its liberation. After the success of Operation Dragoon, she continued to provide fire support along the French and Italian coasts until the spring of 1945, bombarding German holdouts and ensuring they could not interfere with Allied supply lines. She had outlived her 2 sisters to see the final victory. The story of the Bretagne-class is a microcosm of the tumultuous first half of the 20th century. They were conceived in an age of empires and dreadnoughts, served quietly through one world war, and were then thrown into the maelstrom of another, a war for which they were ill-equipped. 2 of the sisters met violent ends, one the victim of a brutal but calculated decision by an ally, the other a victim of national collapse and an act of defiant self-destruction. Only the Lorraine survived, a lonely witness to her sister's fates, who then rose from obscurity to fire the final shots of her long career in the service of liberating her homeland. They were not the most famous or powerful battleships ever built, but the saga of the Bretagne, Provence, and Lorraine remains one of the most compelling and tragic tales in modern naval history. Their legacy is a reminder that in war, the greatest threats can sometimes come from the most unexpected directions, and that even outdated and forgotten warriors can, when the moment comes, find their chance for one last, glorious fight. They were ships of another time, caught in a conflict that had passed them by, but they served to the bitter end. We've delved into the tragic fate of the Bretagne, the scuttling of the Provence, and the triumphant return of the Lorraine. This story is a stark reminder of how political alliances can shift in the fog of war. What other instances in military history can you think of where former allies were forced into conflict with one another? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're always fascinated to see the parallels you draw from history's complex tapestry. And if uncovering these incredible, often overlooked stories of military hardware and history is what you live for, ensure you've hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to make sure you're on board for our next expedition. Finally, what military subject are you most eager to learn about? Let us know in the comments. You help steer the course of this channel.